The morning sun barely filtered through the gray clouds as Helen Brooks stood at the bus stop, clutching an old leather folder to her chest. Inside were sheet music pages she'd printed at the library, carefully protected in plastic sleeves she'd saved from her grocery store receipts. Her hands trembled slightly, though whether from nerves or the chilly October wind she couldn't quite tell. She'd circled this date on her kitchen calendar 6 months ago. October 15th, the day of the regional piano competition auditions. The day she'd either prove to herself that she still had it, or finally close the door on a dream that had been gathering dust for 30 years. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes. Helen spent most of it staring out the window, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood give way to the polished buildings of the arts district. She caught her reflection in the glass and almost laughed at herself. A 52-year-old woman in a floral dress from Goodwill, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun, riding the bus to compete against pianists half her age. What was she thinking? But she'd come too far to turn back now. It had taken her 3 years of working double shifts at the hospital to save the $200 entry fee. 3 years of practicing on a cheap electric keyboard in her tiny apartment, using headphones so she wouldn't disturb the neighbors. 3 years of dreaming about touching a real piano again. The Riverside Concert Hall rose before her like a glass and steel monument to everything she'd lost. She stood on the sidewalk for a full minute just staring up at it. Young people streamed past her through the revolving doors, all of them looking like they belonged there. Designer clothes. Expensive instrument cases, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to choose between your dreams. And feeding your children, Helen took a deep breath and pushed through the doors. The lobby was even more intimidating than she'd imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The floors were polished marble that clicked under her worn flats. And everywhere she looked, there were pianists. Young, beautiful, perfectly put-together pianists. A girl who couldn't have been more than 20 glided past in a black designer gown, her hair styled in an elaborate updo. She was talking on her phone about her recent performance at Carnegie Hall. Another young man adjusted his bow tie in a decorative mirror, his tuxedo probably costing more than Helen's monthly rent. Helen found a seat on a bench near the wall and tried to make herself invisible. She watched as groups of contestants greeted each other with air kisses and talked about their conservatory professors, their upcoming recitals, their summers spent studying in Vienna or Paris. Nobody looked at her. Or rather, when they did glance her way, their eyes slid past her as if she were part of the furniture. She was okay with that. She hadn't come here to make friends. Oh my God, is there a cleaning staff meeting or something? The voice came from a group of 3 young women standing near the refreshment table. They were all dressed in elegant concert attire, their makeup flawless, their posture perfect. The one who'd spoken, a blonde in a burgundy dress, was looking directly at Helen. Her friends giggled. One of them whispered something and they all laughed louder. Helen's face burned, but she kept her eyes down. She'd dealt with worse. Much worse. She'd raised 4 kids on a janitor's salary after her husband died. She'd worked nights cleaning hospital rooms while studying medical coding during the day, trying to make a better life. She'd survived judgmental looks from other parents at school events when she showed up in her work uniform because she couldn't afford to go home and change. She could survive this. "Excuse me, ma'am." A young man in a sleek black suit approached her. For a moment, Helen thought he might be kind, might be coming to welcome her. Then she saw his smirk. "The auditions are for performers. If you're looking for the custodial office, that's in the basement level." More laughter rippled through the lobby. Helen felt dozens of eyes on her now. "I'm here for the audition," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Oh." The young man's eyebrows shot up. He exchanged glances with his friends. "Oh, well, good luck with that." The way he said it made it clear he didn't mean it. Helen stood up, still clutching her folder. She walked to the registration desk, feeling every eye in that lobby following her. The woman behind the desk, a stern-looking administrator with reading glasses on a chain, looked up with an expression that shifted from professional courtesy to confusion. "Can I help you? I'm here to check in." "Helen Brooks? I registered for the 2 o'clock audition slot." The woman typed on her computer, frowning. Brooks, yes, here you are." She glanced up at Helen again, her frown deepening. "You're aware this is a professional competition? The entry fee is non-refundable." "I know." And you understand that judges will be evaluating based on conservatory-level standards? Yes, ma'am. I understand. The administrator printed out a name badge and slid it across the desk. Waiting area is through those doors. They'll call your name when it's time. Helen took the badge and made her way to the waiting area. It was a smaller room with rows of chairs, about half of them filled with nervous-looking contestants. As soon as she entered, conversation stopped. People stared. She found an empty seat in the back corner and sat down, placing her folder on her lap. Her hands were shaking now, really shaking. Not from fear, exactly. More from the weight of everything this moment represented. She'd been 17 when she left music school. Not by choice. Her mother got sick, cancer spreading through her body faster than anyone expected. Someone had to take care of her younger siblings. Someone had to work. The scholarship she'd earned to study piano, the future everyone said was so bright, all of it disappeared in the space of a single phone call from a hospital. 35 years. That's how long it had been since she'd walked away from music. 35 years of survival, of doing what needed to be done, of putting everyone else first. Her siblings, then her own children, then her grandchildren. But her youngest had graduated college last spring. Her siblings were all settled with families of their own. And one night, sitting alone in her apartment, Helen realized something that terrified her. If she didn't try now, she never would. She'd die without knowing if she still had it. If all those years of secret practicing meant anything, if the music that lived in her head could still flow through her fingers. So she'd saved, and practiced, and registered for this audition before she could talk herself out of it. Did someone's grandmother get lost? The voice came from somewhere behind her. More snickering. Maybe she thinks this is a community-centered talent show. Helen closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. She thought about the keyboard in her apartment, how the keys stuck sometimes, how it couldn't capture the full range of dynamics she heard in her mind. She thought about the nights she'd practiced Rachmaninoff with headphones on, tears streaming down her face because the music was still there, still alive inside her after all these years. Let them laugh, let them judge. In a few minutes she'd be at a real piano again. And that was all that mattered. A door opened at the front of the room. Helen Brooks, a young coordinator with a clipboard, stood in the doorway, looking around the room with barely concealed impatience. Helen Brooks, you're up next. Helen stood, her legs steadier than she expected. She walked toward that door, past all the smirking faces and whispered comments. The coordinator looked her up and down, her lips pressing into a thin line. You do understand this is a professional competition? She asked, her tone sharp. We have limited time slots. I understand, Helen replied. The coordinator sighed and pushed open the door to the auditorium. Fine, go ahead. Helen stepped through and the door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the ending of one life and the beginning of another. The auditorium was smaller than Helen had imagined, but somehow that made it more intimidating. Red velvet seats stretched back in neat rows, all empty except for 3 people sitting at a table in the center section. The judges. A magnificent black piano sat on the stage under a single spotlight, looking both inviting and terrifying at the same time. Helen's footsteps echoed as she walked down the aisle. Each step felt like it took forever. She could feel the judges watching her, could almost hear their thoughts. What's she doing here? Who let her in? This is a waste of our time. The judge in the middle, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, didn't even look up from his notepad. He was writing something, probably notes about the previous contestant. The woman to his left had her arms crossed, already looking bored. The third judge, a younger man with thick-rimmed glasses, at least glanced up at her, though his expression wasn't exactly welcoming. Helen climbed the short stairs to the stage. Her legs felt wobbly, like they might give out at any second. The piano bench was exactly where she remembered piano benches being, smooth and solid. She sat down carefully, adjusting her position, letting her fingers hover over the keys without touching them yet. That's when she heard it. Laughter. Muffled, but definitely laughter. She turned her head slightly and noticed the stage curtain wasn't fully closed. Through a gap of about 6 inches, she could see into the wings. Several contestants stood there watching. One of them had their phone out recording. The blonde girl from the lobby was there too, her hand covering her mouth as she whispered to the person next to her. Helen's stomach twisted. They were all watching, all waiting for her to fail. This wasn't just an audition anymore. It was entertainment for them, a joke, something to laugh about later over expensive coffee. Whenever you're ready. The silver-haired judge's voice cut through her thoughts. He still hadn't really looked at her. He was flipping through papers now, organizing them. Please state your name and your piece. Helen cleared her throat. Her mouth felt dry. Helen Brooks. I'll be performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. The first movement. That got their attention. The female judge's eyebrows shot up. The younger judge actually leaned forward. And the silver-haired man finally looked at her directly. That's an orchestral piece, he said flatly. His tone suggested she'd made some kind of stupid mistake, like showing up to the wrong building. Yes, sir. I've arranged it for solo piano. It runs about 8 minutes. The female judge let out a short laugh. Not a kind one. 8 minutes? That's quite ambitious. We typically hear 5-minute excerpts maximum. I can perform less if you'd prefer, Helen offered, though the thought of stopping mid-piece made her chest ache. The silver-haired judge waved his hand dismissively. No, go ahead. Let's see what you've got. The way he said it made it clear he expected nothing. He was already mentally moving on to the next contestant, the one who would actually matter. Helen looked down at the keys. They were perfect. Pristine white and black, not a scratch on them. So different from the yellowed, sticking keys of her electric keyboard at home. She lifted her hands, positioned her fingers, and then hesitated. What if they were right? What if she'd been fooling herself all these years? What if the music in her head couldn't actually translate through her fingers anymore? What if 35 years was just too long of a gap? She thought about her daughter's graduation last May. How proud she'd been watching her baby walk across that stage in her cap and gown. The first person in their family to finish college. Helen had cried through the whole ceremony, not just from pride, but from relief. She'd done it. She'd gotten all 4 of her kids through school, through life. She'd kept them fed and clothed and loved, even when it meant working 3 jobs, even when it meant her hands were raw from cleaning chemicals, even when it meant never ever buying anything for herself. But that night, after the graduation party, sitting alone in her quiet apartment, she'd felt something she hadn't expected. Empty. Lost. Like she'd accomplished everything she was supposed to accomplish. But somewhere along the way she'd disappeared. The girl who used to play piano until her fingers hurt, who used to feel music in her bones, who used to dream of concert halls and standing ovations. That girl had vanished. Except she hadn't. Not completely. She'd been there all along, quiet and patient, waiting. Helen took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She let everything else fall away. The judging eyes. The muffled laughter. The expensive clothes she couldn't afford. The years she'd lost. All of it faded into nothing. And then she began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff filled the auditorium. Soft at first, almost tentative, like a question being asked. Her fingers moved across the keys and it felt like coming home. Like finding a part of herself she'd forgotten existed. She didn't think about technique. She didn't worry about hitting every note perfectly. She just played. She played for the 17-year-old girl who'd had to quit music school. She played for the young mother working night shifts while her baby slept. She played for every moment she'd pressed invisible keys on her kitchen table while cooking dinner, keeping the music alive in the only way she could. The piece began to build. The gentle notes gave way to something more powerful, more urgent. Helen's whole body moved with the music now. Her shoulders swayed. Her foot worked the pedal. She was no longer in that auditorium. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere made entirely of sound and emotion. Behind the judge's table, the silver-haired man had stopped shuffling his papers. His pen hung motionless in his hand. He was staring at the stage, his mouth slightly open. The female judge had uncrossed her arms. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes wide. Her hand moved slowly to her chest, pressing against her heart. The younger judge had taken off his glasses and was wiping his eyes. In the wings, the laughter had stopped. The contestants who'd been mocking her stood frozen, their phones forgotten. The blonde girl's smirk had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like pain. Or maybe recognition. The recognition that real artistry has nothing to do with age or appearance or designer clothes. Helen played on, unaware of any of it. The music poured through her like water that had been dammed up for decades. There were moments of heartbreaking softness, notes so delicate they seemed to float in the air. Then came passages of thundering power that made the piano itself seem to shake. This wasn't a performance. This was a confession. Every note carried the weight of sacrifice, of dreams deferred, of a life lived for others. But it also carried hope. The stubborn, impossible hope that maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still time. The melody climbed higher, more complex. Helen's fingers flew across the keys, executing runs that should have been impossible for someone who practiced on a cheap keyboard, who hadn't had a real lesson in over 3 decades. But they weren't impossible, because she'd never really stopped playing. She'd played in her mind every single day. She'd heard every note, felt every rhythm, lived every phrase 1,000 times over. The auditorium had become completely still. Even the air seemed to be holding its breath. Helen reached the climactic section, the part where the orchestra would normally swell behind the piano. But she didn't need an orchestra. Her arrangement captured everything, the full weight and beauty of Rachmaninoff's vision, all contained in 10 fingers and 88 keys. Tears streamed down the female judge's face now. She wasn't even trying to hide them. The silver-haired man sat perfectly rigid, like he was afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. In the wings, one of the contestants who'd been laughing at Helen earlier slowly sank to the floor, sitting cross-legged, completely transfixed. The phone that had been recording clattered to the ground, forgotten. Helen played the final phrases, the music gradually softening, like a storm passing, like the sun breaking through clouds. The notes became gentler, more reflective, carrying all the bittersweet beauty of a dream remembered. And then silence. Helen's hands remained on the keys for a long moment. She wasn't ready to let go yet. Wasn't ready to come back to reality, to remember where she was and who was watching. But slowly she lifted her fingers. She folded her hands in her lap and stared down at them. These hands that had changed diapers and mopped floors and held her children when they cried. These hands that had never forgotten how to make music. She heard movement. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Helen finally looked up. The silver-haired judge was standing. He was walking toward the stage, his face completely transformed from the bored, dismissive expression he'd worn before. And if Helen wasn't mistaken, his eyes looked wet. Helen sat perfectly still at the piano, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The silence in the auditorium felt heavy, like the air itself had changed into something solid. She couldn't bring herself to look at the judges. Couldn't bear to see disappointment or pity or worse, that bored indifference from before. She'd done what she came to do. She'd played, really played, for the first time in decades on a real piano. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be enough. The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor made her finally lift her eyes. The silver-haired judge was walking toward the stage. Not just walking, striding. His expression was intense, almost urgent. Helen's stomach dropped. He was probably going to tell her she'd gone over time, or that she'd broken some rule she didn't know about. He reached the edge of the stage and stopped. For a long moment he just looked at her, really looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time. "What did you say your name was?" His voice was different now, softer, almost gentle. "Helen Brooks, sir. Helen Brooks." He repeated it slowly, like he was testing how it sounded. "Where did you study?" The question caught her off guard. I attended the Westfield Conservatory. Just for 2 years. That was a long time ago. When? I started when I was 15. Had to leave when I was 17. That was 1988. The judge pulled out his phone and started typing something. The other 2 judges had stood up now too and were making their way toward the stage. The woman's face was streaked with tears, her makeup smudged. She didn't seem to care. "Why did you leave?" the silver-haired judge asked, still looking at his phone. Helen hesitated. These weren't the kinds of questions she'd expected. She thought she'd play, they'd thank her politely, and she'd leave. That was how auditions worked, wasn't it? My mother got sick. Cancer. I had 4 younger siblings. Someone needed to take care of them. And my father had left years before, so I came home. The judge's fingers stopped moving on his phone. He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like pain. "And you never went back? Never continued your training?" Helen shook her head. "No, sir. I got married young, had my own children. My husband passed away 15 years ago. I've been working at Memorial Hospital since then. In housekeeping." She said the last part quietly, waiting for the judgment to return to their faces. But it didn't come. Instead, the younger judge spoke up. His voice was shaky. "That piece you just played, that wasn't just good, that was extraordinary. Where have you been performing? Who have you been studying with?" "I haven't been performing anywhere. I practice at home on an electric keyboard. Sometimes the church down the street lets me use their piano on weekday mornings when it's empty." "An electric keyboard?" The female judge's voice rose in disbelief. "You learned that arrangement on an electric keyboard?" "I didn't learn it recently. I've been playing it in my head for years. I heard every note, every dynamic. I just hadn't had the chance to play it on a real piano until about 6 months ago, and that was only a few times." The silver-haired judge held up his phone. "I found you. There's an article here from the Westfield Journal, dated 1987. Local prodigy takes national youth competition. That's you in the photo. You won first place at the National Young Musicians Competition when you were 16. Helen felt her cheeks flush. That was such a long time ago. I was a different person then. No. The female judge climbed the stairs to the stage. Up close, Helen could see she was older than she'd first appeared, maybe in her late 50s. No, you're exactly the same person. That person who won that competition, she's still in there. I just heard her. Mrs. Brooks, the silver-haired judge said, and Helen noticed he'd switched from her first name to something more formal, more respectful. I need to tell you something. My name is Dr. Robert Chen. I've been teaching piano and judging competitions for 32 years. I've heard thousands of performances from some of the most technically skilled pianists in the world. He paused, and Helen saw his jaw tighten with emotion. What you just did up there, that wasn't just technical skill. Anyone can learn to hit the right notes. What you did was transform that piece into something living and breathing. You didn't just play Rachmaninoff. You understood him. You felt every ounce of longing and beauty and pain in that music, and you made us feel it too. The auditorium doors suddenly burst open. Helen jumped at the sound. Contestants flooded in, dozens of them filling the aisles. They must have been listening from outside or watching from the wings. The blonde girl who'd mocked her in the lobby was there, and the young man in the sleek suit. All of them. But nobody was laughing now. They stood in silence, some of them still wiping their eyes. The blonde girl's perfect makeup was ruined with tears. She caught Helen's eye and mouthed 2 words. "I'm sorry." Dr. Chen turned to face the crowd, then back to Helen. "The truth is, we see a lot of talented people in these competitions. People who've had every advantage. The best teachers, the best instruments, all the time in the world to practice. And many of them are very, very good." He gestured toward Helen. "But every once in a while, maybe once in a career, you hear someone who reminds you why music matters. Someone who shows you that it's not about perfection. It's about truth. It's about taking everything you've lived through, all your joy and pain and sacrifice, and pouring it into something beautiful." The female judge stepped closer to Helen. "My name is Professor Lisa Martinez. I teach at the Riverside Conservatory. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I have to tell you, I have students who've practiced that same piece for months with the best equipment and instruction available. None of them played it like you just did. Why now?" the younger judge asked. He'd introduced himself as Daniel Porter. "After all these years, what made you decide to audition now?" Helen looked down at her hands again. They were shaking. "My youngest daughter graduated from college in May. All 4 of my kids are grown now, living their own lives. And I realized that I'd spent 35 years making sure everyone else got to chase their dreams. My siblings went to school. My kids went to school. Everyone got their chance." Her voice cracked slightly. "But that girl who won that competition when she was 16, who loved music more than anything in the world, I just abandoned her. I left her behind. And I thought, if I don't do this now, if I don't try one more time, I'm going to die without ever knowing if she was still there." "She's still there," Professor Martinez said firmly. "Trust me, she's definitely still there." Dr. Chen looked at the other judges. They nodded at each other, having some kind of silent conversation. Then he turned back to Helen. "Mrs. Brooks, we need to confer officially as judges, and there are still other auditions scheduled for today. But I'm going to break protocol for a moment and tell you something. In 32 years of judging competitions, I've never heard anything like what I just heard." Not once, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Regardless of what happens with the official results, I want you to know that what you did today mattered. Not just for you, but for everyone in this room. You reminded us all what music is supposed to be. One of the contestants in the audience started clapping, then another. Then suddenly the entire auditorium erupted in applause. It wasn't polite, obligatory applause. It was thunderous. The blonde girl was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. Others were whistling, cheering. Helen felt tears spring to her eyes. She'd imagined this moment as a teenager, dreamed of standing ovations and recognition, but this felt different, better somehow, because she'd earned it. Not through privilege or opportunity, but through sheer stubborn refusal to let go of the thing that made her who she was. Dr. Chen held up his hand, and the applause gradually died down. Mrs. Brooks, would you be willing to wait in the lobby for about 30 minutes? The judges need to discuss something, and then we'd like to speak with you again. Of course, Helen managed to say. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She stood up from the piano bench on wobbly legs. As she walked across the stage and down the stairs, contestants stepped aside to let her pass. But this time it wasn't to avoid her. It was respect. The young man in the suit who'd mocked her earlier stepped forward. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier, that was cruel and stupid. You just taught me more about music in 8 minutes than I've learned in 4 years of conservatory. Helen stopped and looked at him. He couldn't have been more than 23, 24, so young. So much still to learn about life. It's okay, she said softly. When I was your age, I probably would have thought the same thing. We all judge what we don't understand. She made her way to the lobby, her legs still shaking, her heart still racing. Through the glass windows, she could see the city continuing on, people rushing past, completely unaware that something extraordinary had just happened inside these walls. Helen sat down on the same bench she'd occupied earlier, in the same corner. But everything felt different now. She felt different, like some part of her that had been sleeping for 35 years had finally woken up. Whatever happened next, whatever the judges decided, she'd done it. She'd played, and for 8 perfect minutes she'd been exactly who she was always meant to be. Helen sat in the lobby watching the clock on the wall tick forward. 30 minutes, Dr. Chen had said. It had been 23. Each minute felt like an hour. She tried not to think about what the judges might be discussing. Tried not to let hope creep in too much, because hope was a dangerous thing when you'd learned to live without it. The lobby had emptied out. Most of the contestants had gone back to the waiting area for their own auditions, but a few lingered, sitting in small groups talking in hushed voices. Every so often, one of them would glance over at Helen, not with mockery anymore, with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or respect. The blonde girl from earlier approached slowly, almost hesitantly. Up close, Helen could see she was even younger than she'd thought. 20 at most. She had the kind of beauty that came with youth and money and a life that had probably never known real hardship. Excuse me, the girl said quietly. I know I have no right to talk to you after how I acted earlier, but I needed to say something. Helen looked up at her and waited. I've been playing piano since I was 4 years old. My parents spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on lessons, on competitions, on the best schools. I've performed at Carnegie Hall twice. I've won regional competitions. Everyone tells me I'm talented. She paused, her voice cracking. But I've never played like that. I've never made anyone cry. I hit all the right notes, I follow all the technical rules, but it's empty. And hearing you play, I realized I don't actually love music. I just love winning. Helen didn't know what to say. The girl's honesty was startling. I'm sorry for laughing at you. I'm sorry for judging you. You showed me what I've been missing all these years. The girl wiped her eyes. Thank you. She walked away before Helen could respond. Helen sat there, stunned. She'd come here today expecting nothing from anyone. Certainly not gratitude, certainly not apologies. The door to the auditorium opened. Professor Martinez stepped out, looking around the lobby until she spotted Helen. She walked over quickly, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Helen, would you come with me, please? Helen's heart jumped into her throat. This was it. Whatever they decided, she was about to find out. She stood up, her folder clutched against her chest like a shield, and followed Professor Martinez through the doors. The auditorium looked different now. The stage lights were brighter. The 3 judges sat at their table, but their papers were organized, their expressions serious. Several other people sat in the audience now. Officials from the competition, Helen guessed. This felt formal, official. Please have a seat, Dr. Chen said, gesturing to a chair they'd placed in front of the judge's table. Not on stage this time. Right there, facing them, Helen sat. Her hands gripped the armrests of the chair. Dr. Chen leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. Helen, we've spent the last half hour discussing your performance. We've also made some phone calls. To the Westfield Conservatory, to the organization that ran that national competition you won. We've been trying to understand your story. He paused and Helen's stomach twisted with anxiety. Here's what we learned. You were accepted to Westfield on a full scholarship at 15. Your teachers there said you were the most naturally gifted student they'd seen in decades. After you won the national competition at 16, you were offered scholarships to 3 of the top music schools in the country. Juilliard, Curtis, the Boston Conservatory. Helen nodded slowly. She remembered those letters, remembered reading them in her mother's hospital room, knowing she'd never be able to accept them. And then you just disappeared. Professor Martinez continued. Your teachers tried to find you. They wanted to help, to find a way to keep you in music. But you were gone. There's actually a small article about it in the conservatory's archives. Prodigy pianist vanishes from music world. They thought you'd quit because of pressure or burnout. They had no idea what you were really facing. Daniel Porter, the younger judge, spoke up. Helen, what you sacrificed, what you gave up to take care of your family, that's extraordinary. But what's even more extraordinary is that you never really gave up music. You kept it alive somehow, against all odds. Dr. Chen cleared his throat. We need to tell you our decision about the competition. Normally, we'd wait until all auditions are complete before announcing results, but the 3 of us are in unanimous agreement and we feel you deserve to know now. Helen's hands tightened on the armrests. This was the moment. The moment she'd find out if this crazy dream had been worth it. First place in this competition comes with a $10,000 prize and a full scholarship to the Riverside Conservatory's master's program. 2 years of study, all expenses paid. Helen's breath caught. Helen Brooks, we're offering you first place, Dr. Chen said simply, pending the remaining auditions, which is just a formality. We've all been doing this long enough to know when we've heard something special, and what you played today, that was beyond special. The room tilted slightly. Helen gripped the chair harder to steady herself. $10,000. A scholarship. First place. The words didn't seem real. I don't understand, she whispered. There are all these other talented people. Young people with training and experience and technical skill. Professor Martinez interrupted. Yes, they have technical skill. Some of them have quite a lot of it. But Helen, you have something that can't be taught. You have lived experience, emotional depth, and an ability to communicate truth through music. That's art. Real art. And it's rare. But I can't accept the scholarship, Helen said, the words tumbling out. I have a job. I have bills. I can't just go back to school full-time. I'm 52 years old. That scholarship should go to someone who can actually use it. Someone with a future ahead of them. The 3 judges exchanged glances. Dr. Chen smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Helen had seen from him. We anticipated you might say that, which is why we have a different proposal. He pulled out some papers from a folder on the table. The Riverside Conservatory is prepared to offer you a position. A paid position. We want you to be our artist in residence, Helen blinked. I don't know what that means. It means we want you to teach, Professor Martinez explained, her voice warm. Not full-time. Part-time, flexible hours, whatever works with your current job situation, until you're ready to transition. You'd work with our students, teach them what you know, perform occasionally, share your story, show them that music isn't just about technical perfection. But I'm not qualified to teach at a conservatory, Helen protested. I never finished my training. I don't have a degree. You have something better than a degree, Daniel Porter said. You have authenticity. Our students, they're incredibly skilled. But many of them are exactly like that young woman who apologized to you. They know how to play, but they don't know how to feel. They don't know how to take life and turn it into art. You can teach them that. Dr. Chen slid the papers across the table. The position pays $45,000 a year to start. Part-time, 20 hours a week. You'd have full access to our practice facilities, including private studio time whenever you want. And if you decide later that you want to pursue that master's degree, the scholarship offer stands. No time limit. Helen stared at the papers. The numbers and words blurred together. $45,000. For teaching music. For doing something she loved. We're also going to arrange for you to perform at our winter concert series, Professor Martinez added. It's in 3 months. Sold-out shows, professional venue. You'd be featured as our artist in residence. We want people to hear you play. Really hear you, why? Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are you doing all this for me? Dr. Chen's expression softened. Because 20 years from now, I want to be able to tell people I was there the day Helen Brooks walked back into music. Because your story matters. Because talent like yours doesn't come along often, and when it does, we have a responsibility to nurture it, even if it arrives later than expected. He leaned back in his chair. But more than that, because our students need to see you. They need to see that it's never too late, that life can take you on detours, force you to make impossible choices, and you can still find your way back. That's a lesson worth more than any technical training we could ever provide. Helen looked down at her hands. These hands that had scrubbed floors and changed bed sheets and worked so hard for so long. These hands that had never forgotten how to make music. Can I think about it? She asked quietly. Of course, Professor Martinez said. Take all the time you need. But Helen, I hope you say yes. I really do. Helen stood up slowly, still clutching the papers. Her whole body felt light, like she might float away. She turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at the 3 judges. Thank you, she said. Not just for this. For listening. For really listening? No, Dr. Chen replied, his eyes bright. Thank you. For reminding us why we fell in love with music in the first place. Helen walked out of the auditorium in a daze. The lobby was quiet now. She sat back down on her bench and stared at the papers in her hands. The official letterhead. The numbers. The opportunity. She thought about her apartment, about her electric keyboard with its sticking keys. She thought about her job at the hospital, the night shifts, the tired muscles. She thought about all the years of sacrifice, of putting everyone else first. And then she thought about those 8 minutes at the piano. How alive she'd felt, how complete. For the first time in 35 years, Helen Brooks allowed herself to hope. Really, truly hope. Not for her children's future or her siblings' success, for herself. For the girl who'd never really died, just waited patiently in the silence. She pulled out her phone and called her daughter. Mom, how did it go? Are you okay? Helen smiled, tears streaming down her face. Sweetheart, I need to tell you something. Something wonderful just happened. 3 months later, Helen stood backstage at the Riverside Concert Hall, listening to the murmur of the crowd filing into their seats. She peeked through the curtain and felt her stomach flip. Every seat was filled. Over 800 people had come to hear the winter concert series, and according to Professor Martinez, most of them had come specifically to hear the woman everyone was calling the comeback pianist. Her story had spread faster than she'd ever imagined. A local newspaper had picked it up first, then a regional magazine, then somehow it had ended up on national news. Woman returns to piano after 35 years, stuns competition judges. The headline felt surreal every time she saw it. But it wasn't the attention that made her nervous tonight. It was the people in the front row. Her 4 children all sitting together, her 2 sisters and brother, who'd traveled from 3 different states to be here, her grandchildren, fidgeting with excitement in their fancy clothes, and sitting right in the center, her oldest daughter Amy was holding a framed photo of Helen's mother, the woman who'd gotten sick all those years ago and unknowingly changed the entire course of Helen's life. You're going to be amazing. Professor Martinez appeared beside her, radiant in a deep blue gown. I've heard you practice this piece 100 times. You know it backwards and forwards. Helen smoothed down her dress. It was new, the first new dress she'd bought in over a decade. Simple and elegant, deep burgundy with 3/4 sleeves. Her daughter had taken her shopping, insisting that she needed something special for tonight. Helen had cried in the dressing room. Not because the dress was expensive, but because she'd forgotten what it felt like to buy something beautiful just for herself. What if I freeze up? Helen whispered. What if I get out there and forget everything? Then you'll remember again, Professor Martinez said simply. That's what musicians do. We forget, we remember, we keep going. But Helen, you're not going to freeze. I've watched you teach for the past 3 months. You don't freeze anymore. You flourish, it was true. The teaching had been the biggest surprise of all. Helen had been terrified that first day, walking into a classroom full of conservatory students who'd spent their whole lives preparing for music careers. What could she possibly teach them? Everything, as it turned out. She'd started by telling them her story. Not to impress them, but to be honest. She told them about quitting school, about the electric keyboard, about practicing in her head because she couldn't afford a real piano. She told them about the night she'd sat alone in her apartment and realized she'd abandoned herself, and then she'd played for them. Not perfectly, not with the technical precision they were used to from their other professors, but with truth, with feeling, with the kind of raw honesty that only comes from living a full life. One student, a talented young man who'd been on track to graduate top of his class, had broken down crying after her first demonstration. "I've been playing piano for 18 years, he'd said, but I've never actually said anything with it. I've just been showing off." That's what Helen taught them. Not technique, not theory, but how to say something, how to take the composer's notes and filter them through their own experiences, their own hearts, their own truth, how to play like they meant it. The conservatory students had started calling her sessions soul class because that's what she taught them. How to play with soul. 5 minutes, the stage manager called out. Helen took a deep breath. She thought about that day 3 months ago, walking into the audition with everyone staring at her like she didn't belong. She thought about the laughter, the mockery, the assumptions people had made based on her age and appearance. And then she thought about everything that had happened since. The job offer she'd accepted after 3 days of agonizing over the decision. The way her supervisor at the hospital had hugged her and told her to go, to finally do something for herself. The first paycheck from the conservatory that had been more than she used to make in a month of night shifts. The way her hands had stopped aching from cleaning chemicals and started aching from practice instead. A good ache. A purposeful ache. The way her apartment didn't feel lonely anymore because she finally felt whole. "Ladies and gentlemen," she heard Dr. Chen's voice boom through the speakers. He was introducing her from the stage. "Tonight we have something special for you. 3 months ago, a woman walked into our competition auditions. On paper, she didn't look like much. She hadn't performed professionally in over 3 decades. She'd been working as a hospital janitor. She practiced on a cheap keyboard in a small apartment. Everyone in that building underestimated her. Helen heard the crowd grow quieter, more attentive, and then she played. And in 8 minutes, she reminded every single person in that auditorium what music is really about. Not perfection, not pedigree, but truth, passion, the courage to take everything you've lived through and pour it into something beautiful. The applause started, even though Helen hadn't appeared yet. Since joining our faculty, she's transformed our students' understanding of what it means to be an artist. She's shown them that it's never too late. That life's detours aren't failures, they're experiences. They're the very things that give our art meaning. Professor Martinez squeezed Helen's hand. "Go show them who you are. Please welcome to the stage our artist-in-residence, Helen Brooks." The applause grew louder. Helen walked out from behind the curtain and the sound became thunderous. People were standing. Her children were on their feet, clapping and crying. Her brother was wiping his eyes. The conservatory students she'd been teaching, sitting together in a block of seats on the left side, were cheering like she'd already finished performing. Helen made her way to the piano, that same Steinway grand from the audition. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked out at all those faces. 3 months ago, she would have been paralyzed by this much attention. But something had shifted inside her. She wasn't performing to prove anything anymore. She was performing because this was who she was. This was where she belonged. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Tonight's piece was different from the audition. She'd chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the pieces her mother had loved. Helen had played it for her mother in the hospital during those final weeks, on the ancient upright piano in the hospital's family room. Back then, she'd thought it was goodbye. Goodbye to her mother, goodbye to music, goodbye to the future she'd dreamed of. But it hadn't been goodbye. It had been see you later. The nocturne flowed through her fingers like water, like memory, like love. Each note was a thank you. Thank you to her mother for teaching her that sacrifice was sometimes necessary. Thank you to her children for growing up to be good humans despite having so little. Thank you to herself, to that 17-year-old girl who'd made the hardest choice and somehow survived it. The melody climbed and fell, whispered and sang. Helen felt tears on her cheeks but didn't stop playing. In the front row, Amy lifted the photo of their grandmother, and Helen played to that photo, played to the woman who'd never gotten to see this moment but somehow had made it possible. The piece moved toward its conclusion, those final delicate notes that always reminded Helen of stars coming out at twilight. Soft, inevitable, beautiful. She played the last note and let it ring out. Her hand still on the keys, her eyes closed. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before the applause crashed over her like a wave. But this time Helen wasn't afraid of it. She stood and turned to face the audience, really face them, and she smiled. Her children rushed the stage, breaking every concert hall rule in the book. They surrounded her, hugging her, crying, laughing. Her youngest son, now 23 and graduating with his engineering degree next spring, whispered in her ear, "Mom, you did it. You actually did it. We did it," Helen corrected him. "All of us together." Because that was the truth she'd learned over these past months. She hadn't lost 35 years. She'd invested them. In family, in love, in building a life that meant something. And now finally, she got to invest in herself too. Not instead of them. Alongside them. Dr. Chen appeared on stage, gently shooing her children back to their seats so the concert could continue. But before Helen could leave the stage, he handed her something. An envelope. "Open it later," he said quietly. "But I wanted you to have it tonight." Helen nodded and slipped it into her pocket. She walked off stage to another round of applause, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Later that night, back in her apartment that didn't feel quite so small anymore, Helen opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a check. The letter was from the Westfield Conservatory, her old school. "Dear Helen, we've followed your story with great interest and pride. We're establishing a scholarship in your name for students who have to leave school due to family circumstances. The Helen Brooks Second Chance Scholarship will help ensure that other talented musicians get the support they need to return to music, no matter how much time has passed. Enclosed is the first donation toward this fund. The check was for $25,000, donated by her former teachers who'd never forgotten the prodigy who disappeared." Helen sat down at her new piano, a beautiful upright the conservatory had given her for her apartment, and played, not for an audience, not for judges, just for herself, for the girl she'd been, the woman she'd become, and all the music that had waited patiently in the silence for its moment to sing. Outside her window, the city hummed with life. Somewhere out there, someone else was probably giving up on their dreams, thinking it was too late, thinking they'd missed their chance. Helen hoped her story would reach them, hoped they'd understand that it's never too late, that dreams deferred aren't dreams denied, that sometimes the long way around is exactly the right path. She played until her fingers grew tired, until the moon rose high above the buildings, until she'd said everything she needed to say. And then she closed the piano, turned off the lights, and went to bed with a smile on her face. Tomorrow she'd teach her soul class. Tomorrow she'd practice for next month's performance. Tomorrow she'd keep building this new life she'd found, or maybe reclaimed, or maybe created for the very first time. But tonight, she'd simply be grateful. For second chances. For patient dreams. For the courage to walk through those auditorium doors and play like she meant it. Because she had. And she always would.